Think about what vary means in real life. It means that something is changing. It means the same thing in math, that something is changing, and we don't know what that thing is that's changing. And so in math, we often use letters to represent what's changing. A lot of times you're used to seeing the letter X, perhaps the letter Y, but it can be any letter you choose that represents the thing that's changing. This shouldn't be new to you. They've been getting you ready for this idea of variables since you were really young, with the idea of those math equations that had the box in them. And when you were little, you were asked to fill in the box. Well, what you were filling in was the variable, or the thing that was unknown. So now we would write this equation a little more sophisticated, and we'd use an x instead. And you can see in both situations that x really represents the number 8. So the hard part of math can be translating between these two worlds, the English world and the math world, but they're really foreign languages and we need to interpret between them. So before we can actually use variables, I need you to think about what words we use in English that imply that we should add something. Or what words in our English language mean we should take away, oops, there's a hint, or subtract something. And then come up with ideas or a list of words that mean multiply and a list of words that mean divide, because you're going to refer back to this list. So pause the video and write down as many as you can. Here are some little phrases that I came up with that indicate these words. You might have more than me, which is fine. You might have some that you want to add to your list, but you're going to need to know what these words mean. And you're going to need to know what they mean so that you can write an expression in math. Now, an expression builds upon just one variable sitting there by itself. An expression is a mathematical phrase, and it includes variables, but also adds on the operation symbols, meaning addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and then it will include numbers sometimes. Now that word phrase is really important in this statement too, because it just translates back to English again. A phrase is an incomplete sentence if you think about it. It has the parts of a full sentence, but it's not complete yet. And that's the same thing in math. So an expression is very different than an equation. An equation, and I'll talk about this a little bit on the next slide, has an equal sign because it's complete. But an expression is like only one part of a mathematical statement. So we're going to do some examples where we're writing algebraic expressions. And it starts off with 7 more than n. And so when you think about this, more than needs to trigger the idea that you're going to be adding. But you're going to be adding to n in this case, and this one can be confusing for that reason. And so because you're 7 more than n, well, think about it. If you had, say, 2 things and you were 7 more than that, you would end up adding that 7 after the fact. The difference of n and 7, well, difference means subtraction, so I like to write it down right away. And then in this case, usually, it's written in the order that it's stated. So it's the difference of or between that n and 7. And so the n would come first and the 7 would come second. Product means multiplication, and again, the order can be written in the way it's listed in the phrase. So it's the product of 7 and n. And so you can write 7, and let's use dots, no x's, because that might be mistaken for a variable. So it's 7 times n, and then perhaps you've seen it where they don't write that dot to represent multiplication. They just put the two together because it happens so often. And so when you see something like this, a 7n, that indicates multiplication. Quotient should trigger that you're doing a division, and the trick there is the first thing they write usually goes on the top of the division bar, so it's the quotient of n and 7. You try to write these down here, and then I will come back in a little bit and you can check them. So pause the video. Alright, and here are those translations. This one was pretty easy, I would think, and then 12 minus m maybe was okay. Quotient is actually turns out to be easy as long as you know it's division. This one might cause a little trouble. You might have flipped these around. The more you do these, the better you'll get at it. But you need to kind of take it out of the math and think about it in real life, that it's saying 23 less than another number. And so that number minus 23 is how it would translate. Here's multiplication, and then here we're combining more than one operation. So we had 3 times n, which is indicated by that 3n there, and then minus 6. And 2 more, then there's twice a number. So here's the twice a number plus 2 more. And you could have had this 2 out front, and that would still be okay. You're allowed to do that with addition statements. In this example, we're going to talk about writing an expression by picking a variable, because very often in the translations they'll just say a number, and that can really confuse kids. But it's confusing because you are given the choice to pick what letter will represent your number. And sometimes you might want a C if you're talking about cats, or you might want to use a B if you're talking about buses. In this case, they're just talking about a number. So I'm going to pick an N to represent that number, but you could pick an X because kids like those X's. But the idea is the same. It says 2 times a number, and so you know there's a multiplication going on there, and then you're going to add 5 to it. In the second one, it says 7 less than a number. And so you start with a number. Maybe I'll change it up. I'll put a y in there. So you have some number y, and you need to represent 7 less than that. So that's what this expression does for you. So you just try the last 3. Just pause the video. And here are those answers. Again, pretty straightforward. I think we've actually had this one before, but I used an F instead. And then here's how they can get more complicated. They're talking about the sum of twice a number and 31. And again, sometimes you have to take your brain out of the math problem and think about what that really looks like in real life. And I promised you we'd talk about the idea of an equation, and again, an equation is just that mathematical sentence. So where an expression was a phrase, an equation is a mathematical sentence. It's a complete statement. And so to represent that complete statement, we use that equal sign. All right, and one indicator that you have an equation in front of you is if you're reading the sentence and it has the word is in it. And I'm going to write it really big because in math is meaning your equal sign. Okay? I wrote that pretty sloppy. So is means equal to. All right, so in an expression, again, I'll give you an example of what that would look like. You might have x plus 2. Notice it's an incomplete statement, some number plus 2. But in an equation, the equal sign will be there, and it will be a complete statement saying some number plus 2 is 8. And then the question might be, what is that number? And of course, you can do mental math to figure that out. So let's do some examples writing an equation. Down here it says the sum of 4 and x is 14. And sometimes when I see that, I like to write that part of my mathematical equation first. It is 14, so something equals 14. And then I dig out the word sum, and I know that I'm adding. So the sum of 4 and x is 14. N divided by 12 is 4. There's lots of ways you can attack this. I've just come up with my ways over the years. So I'll start with this part of the sentence first. It's a number n divided by 12, and again the order in which they list them is usually the way it's written top to bottom. So a number divided by 12 is 4, and then finally 16 is, and so you can translate that. You can put it on the left side if you want. 16 is the product of, and so I know I'm multiplying 4 and a number. So you might have written it this way. You can switch the sides, the left and right sides of the equal sign. That doesn't matter. You could maybe write it without that dot indicating multiplication. So 4n is 16 is another way of writing it. And it doesn't matter, whatever you prefer.